Oscar Wilde, born October 16th, 1854, died November 30th, 1900, and is of course still dead today. His full name was Oscar Fingal O'Flaherty Wills Wilde. He was an Anglo-Irish playwright, novelist, poet, and short story writer. He lived in late Victorian London. In his time, he was a major celebrity who possessed a quick and sharp wit. And one of the many sort of witticisms around him was he was apparently at a party and someone said something clever, and Oscar Wilde said, "I wish I'd said that." And the person replied back, "You will, Oscar, you will." He was, on a more serious and somber note, he was convicted and imprisoned on the ground of a gross indecency, as it was called then, for a homosexual act. He was quite a prolific writer. His poetry included poems, 1881, The Ballad of Reading Gaol, which I'm probably horribly mispronouncing, in 1898, and his plays included Vera, or The Nihilist, 1880, The Duchess of Padoue, which I'm probably horribly mispronouncing as well, 1883, Salome, or Salome, 1893, Lady Windermere's Fan, 1892, A Woman of No Importance, 1893, An Ideal Husband, 1895, The Importance of Being Earnest, 1895 also. For his prose, he wrote The Canterville Ghost in 1887, which, somewhat oddly enough, was made into a movie by Disney, live action, of course, quite some time ago. He also wrote The Happy Prince and Other Stories, published in 1888, The Portrait of Mr. W.H., 1889, Lord Arthur Saville's Crime and Other Stories, 1891, Intentions, 1891, The Picture of Dorian Gray, 1891, also made it into a movie. Famous character, he's the one that has the magical painting that ages and suffers what he would have suffered. The House of Pomegranates, 1891, The Soul of Man Under Socialism, in the Pall Mall Gazette, 1891, and published as a book in 1904, and De Profundis, published in 1905. Now his work that we're concerned with here is, appropriately enough, the New Aesthetics. And it's a dialogue with two characters, Vivian and Cyril. Vivian wins, so in the usual analysis of a dialogue, the character that is best portrayed and wins is typically the view being expressed by the author. So when talking about Wilde and mentioning Vivian, I will assume, is speaking for Oscar Wilde. So Vivian puts forth the following position, reversing the usual order of things. Normally we say that art imitates life, but Vivian claims that life imitates art more than art imitates life, that life will hold a mirror up to art and reproduce a strange imagined type, or realizes in fact what was dreamed in fiction. Now, so his view is essentially that this is what occurs, the reversal of the usual, namely that it is life imitating art, rather than art imitating life. Now, the first sort of argument he gives is an argument by example, and this is something that will seem familiar today because we have similar claims being made. He says life imitates art even to detrimental effects, and he notes that young men have committed suicide because Rolla and Werther did so. And essentially what he's asserting here, it's something that's a common assertion today, that people in real life imitate art in ways that are violent. In this case, suicide. And of course, people often make the claim that when you have mass shooters, they're replicating art. For example, when the shooting that occurred at Columbine, there were claims that the shooters were imitating the movie The Matrix, because of their clothing style, also influenced by the music of Marilyn Manson, and also affected by the video game Doom. And so Wilde's claim here does seem to have some support. So then the character of Cyril responds back and challenges Vivian. So what Vivian must do, according to Cyril's challenge, is that Vivian must show that nature, no less than life, is an imitation of art. That nature follows the landscape painter, for example, and takes her effects from him. So that's a challenge being laid out, that Vivian has to prove that nature, no less than life, imitates art. So how does Vivian make the case? Well, Vivian begins with the following claim, that the change in London's climate, being very foggy, is entirely due to a particular school of art. Why? Well, the assertion is that the fogs that blur gas lamps and change houses into monstrous shadows come from the Impressionists, and that the Impressionists are also responsible for the silver mist that turned bridges and barges to faint forms of fading grace. And so the assertion is that nature is our creation and not a mother who has borne us. So what could he possibly mean by these claims? Well, one sort of odd way to look at it would be that, in a very literal sense, that the artists are creating these effects. Long ago, when I was a kid, there was a TV show about a kid who had a magic crayon, and whatever the person drew would become real. And apparently that's been recreated in various forms over the years. And maybe that, but pretty clearly not. So he probably doesn't think that. So what does he think? Well, he draws an important distinction between looking and seeing. And he's going to use this to make his case that life and nature imitate art. So he asserts that things are because we see them. Now, he could be taken as endorsing a view called phenomenology, idealism. There's another famous dead Brit, George Berkeley, who said that to be is to be perceived. And so if for something to exist is for it to be, seen, heard, etc. And Berkeley's principle is known as esse est percipi, to be is to be perceived. But Wilde probably doesn't, and actually pretty clearly doesn't mean that. So what is he saying? Well, he says what we see and how we see it depends on how the arts have influenced us. And he does draw a very reasonable distinction between looking and seeing. And this can be regarded as analogous to the distinction between listening and hearing. Because one can hear something, that is to say it's registering, on one's ears and auditory nerves, without listening, without paying attention. And this, one, very clear, concrete example would be one can hear someone speaking in a language they don't understand, but one cannot really listen because one does not understand. So, what is it for Wilde to look versus see? Well, he claims that you don't see anything until you see its beauty. Only then does it come into existence. And again, he's probably not endorsing philosophical phenomenology, idealism, that literally to be is to be perceived. This seems more metaphorical. And he uses the example of fogs. He claims that people see fogs not because there are fogs, but because artists taught them the loveliness of such effects. And it's here that he seems to indicate that, he's not really a phenomenologist, because he says, there may have been fogs for centuries in London, but no one saw them, so we know nothing about them. And he asserts, kind of wildly, that fogs did not exist till art had invented them. So the gist of his ideas is that we can have, say, fogs registering on our optic nerves, so we're looking at them, but we don't truly see them until art shows us how to see them. Likewise, to use the analogy, this is not his analogy, but use an analogy, if you hear someone speaking a language you don't understand, you hear the language, but you can't listen. But once you learn the language, then you can listen. So one way to look at it is that art is teaching us the language, so now we can not merely look, but actually see. Wilde then turns from the dialogue to nature's imitation of art, and notes that art creates a unique effect and then moves on. And nature, he says, just keeps repeating the same thing until we get tired of it. And he gives the example about how, at the time he's writing this, no one now talks about the beauty of a sunset. Sunsets belong to a time when Turner was the last note in art. And so the character of Vivian describes a sunset as a second-rate Turner, and asserts that life often commits the same error. It produces false Renés, sham Vautrins, as nature gives a doubtful, painting and a questionable Rousseau. So he asserts that nature irritates one more when she does such things. It seems so stupid, so obvious, so unnecessary. Now, and he asserts also that when art is more varied, nature will too. And no one would deny that nature imitates art, and is the one thing that keeps her in touch with civilized man. So, talking a bit about the sunsets in terms of how the nature just keeps doing the same thing, whereas art keeps changing, and no real solid arguments in there. But that's the claim, that it's imitation of art. Then they move on to a very important question in aesthetics, also art history, which is this. Cyril claims that art expresses, the following things. First, that it expresses the temper of its age. Second, the spirit of its time. And third, the moral and social conditions that surround it, and under whose influence it is produced. And this is a view that seems commonly accepted in art history and cultural, criticism. The idea being that art is all about its time and all about the morality and social conditions of its time. And I include the example here of a statue that I recall amazingly well from the art history class I took centuries ago when I was an undergraduate. And I remember the book quite vividly. It showed this particular statue, the Tetrarchs, at the end of the Roman Empire. And the idea was that the art is inferior to earlier Greek and Roman work, and also the figures are kind of small and huddled together. And the idea was it showed the shrinking of the Roman Empire and showed the fear of the rulers. And if you take an art history class, at least if you took it like the one I did, the general idea was throughout the art history class about how the historical setting, the temper of its age, the spirit of its time, the moral and social conditions that surrounded the work and under whose influence it was produced, how those shaped the art. As another example, the Greek approach to statues and architecture was explained in terms of Greek culture. The Egyptian works were explained in terms of Egyptian culture, and so on for all times. And obviously this is not a wildly improbable theory that that's what art does, but that's the claim put forth by Cyril. So what does Vivian, to say Wilde, say in response? Well, the response made is this. The character Vivian claims, contrary to Cyril, that art never expresses anything but itself. And this is one of the principles of the new aesthetics. Now, because of this, he takes music to be the type of all the arts. So this raises the question then, why do people, collectively and as individuals, think that the art is about them? Because again, when people talk about art today, they talk about it connecting to their own time. When they look at historical art, they talk about historical art connecting to its time. So why? Well, his answer is essentially the same answer to the question why someone thinks this song's about them, the classic song. And the answer is, of course, because we're so vain. We think the muses are speaking of us, and we try to find a mirror in art that reflects on us. So our vanity causes us to think today's art is about us, about our morality, about our times, our concerns, our struggles. And of course, logically, we would have to say that since we weren't around then, we have to say the same was true then, from vanity. Now, he puts in a note about Marsyas, which I'm probably horribly pronouncing, and he says that we forget the singer of life is not Apollo, the god of the sun, but Marsyas. In the story of Marsyas, like most Greek stories, it ends really horribly. Marsyas found a flute discarded by a goddess and challenged Apollo to a contest of music. He lost, and was of course flayed alive. And I guess Wilde's point is it's horrible. So he claims, continuing the notion of vanity, that art reveals to us her own perfection, and the crowd, us, we fancy that we're being told our history, that it's expressing our spirit. But he asserts this is not so. The highest art rejects the burden of the spirit and gains more from a new medium or fresh material than from enthusiasm for art, lofty passions, or any great awakening of the human consciousness. So he closes this part by asserting that art develops purely on its own lines. She is not symbolic of any age, and the ages are the symbols of art. So explicitly rejecting kind of the stock view that art reflects its time, its ethics of that time, and the culture.